Don't embarrass the family. Don't disappoint us. Don't make us look bad. But hearing it on her wedding day hurt more than ever. Around them, guests chatted and laughed, completely unaware of the conversation taking place behind the chapel doors. Richard looked toward the ceremony hall and sighed heavily. People are already talking. Sarah felt her chest tighten. What are they saying? What do you think they're saying? Richard snapped. They're asking why my daughter is marrying a mechanic. Sarah lowered her eyes. Daniel is more than that. Richard laughed bitterly. Really? Because from where I'm standing, he's a man with grease on his hands and no future. The words fell like a knife. But Sarah had heard worse. And not just from her father. Her sisters had spent months mocking her. Her relatives had whispered behind her back. Even some of her friends had questioned her decision. Yet through all of it, Daniel had never once complained. Never once defended himself. Never once fought back. That was one of the reasons she loved him. Richard stepped closer. I'm giving you one last chance. Sarah looked up. A chance to do what? Walk away. Her eyes widened. Dad, the wedding starts in 10 minutes. So, the guests are already here. So, the groom is waiting. So, Sarah stared at him. Richard folded his arms. You deserve better. A sad smile crossed her face. No, Dad. What? I deserve someone who loves me. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Richard looked away. One day you'll regret this. Sarah's eyes became glassy. Maybe. Richard nodded. Good. But it won't be because I married Daniel. Before Richard could respond, Sarah stepped around him. Then she paused. Dad? What? A faint smile appeared on her lips. After today, you'll finally know who Daniel really is. Richard frowned. What does that supposed to mean? But Sarah simply walked away, leaving him confused, leaving him irritated, leaving him completely unaware of what was about to happen. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this take a lot of work to create, and your support helps us bring you more emotional stories every week. Sarah had always been different from the rest of her family. The Carter family was wealthy, not billionaire wealthy, but wealthy enough to care deeply about status. Richard Carter had spent 30 years building his real estate company. Everything in his life revolved around appearances. The house, the cars, the country club memberships, the business connections. The family image, especially the family image. He wanted his children to reflect success. His oldest daughter, Victoria, was married to a surgeon. His youngest daughter, Emily, was engaged to a corporate attorney. Then there was Sarah, the middle child, the disappointment, at least in Richard's eyes. Sarah never cared much about money. She cared about people. She volunteered. She donated. She spent weekends helping others. Richard never understood her. Kindness doesn't pay bills, he often said. Sarah would always smile. Maybe not, but it makes life worth living. Those conversations usually ended with Richard shaking his head in frustration. Things became even worse the day Sarah met Daniel. It happened on a rainy afternoon. Sarah's car broke down on the side of the road. She sat inside, frustrated and worried. Then a pickup truck stopped nearby. A man stepped out. He approached carefully. Are you okay? Sarah rolled down her window. I think my car is dead. The man smiled. Mind if I take a look? 20 minutes later, the engine was running again. Sarah reached for her wallet. How much do I owe you? The man laughed. Nothing. She blinked. Nothing. It took 10 minutes. You still helped me. He shrugged. Then buy someone coffee someday. That was Daniel. Simple, kind, unexpected. Over the following weeks, they kept running into each other. One conversation became two. Two became five. Five became dinner. Dinner became love. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt truly understood. Daniel listened, really listened. When she talked about her dreams, he cared. When she worried about her family, he comforted her. When she doubted herself, he encouraged her. Something her father rarely did. One evening, Daniel finally met Richard. The dinner started badly, and only got worse. Richard studied Daniel from across the table. So, what do you do? Daniel calmly took a sip of water. I work on cars. Richard nodded slowly. A mechanic? Yes. The table became quiet. Victoria exchanged a glance with Emily. Neither bothered hiding their judgment. Richard leaned back. And that's your long-term plan? Daniel smiled politely. I enjoy my work. That's not what I asked. Sarah immediately recognized the tone. The same tone Richard used whenever he wanted someone to feel small. Daniel remained calm. I like solving problems. Richard chuckled. That doesn't answer the question. Sarah finally spoke. Dad. What? Stop. Richard raised both hands. I'm just making conversation. But everyone knew he wasn't, and the dinner only became more uncomfortable from there. By the time Daniel left that night, Richard had already made up his mind. The mechanic wasn't good enough. Not for Sarah. Not for the family. And definitely not for the Carter name. What Richard didn't know was that Daniel was hiding a secret large enough to change all of their lives forever. Richard's opinion of Daniel only grew worse after that dinner. Every time Sarah mentioned his name, Richard found a reason to criticize him. He's holding you back. You're settling. You're too smart to waste your future. At first, Sarah tried to argue. Eventually, she stopped. Nothing she said mattered. Richard had already decided who Daniel was, and no amount of evidence would change his mind. The situation exploded 6 months later. Daniel proposed. It happened during a quiet evening at the lakeside park, where they had shared their first official date. There were no cameras, no social media influencers, no expensive fireworks, just the two of them. Daniel looked into her eyes and held out a ring. Sarah Carter, you made every day of my life better than the one before it. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I don't have the perfect speech. She laughed through her tears. Good. Neither do I. Daniel smiled. But I know one thing. What? I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Sarah covered her mouth. Daniel, will you marry me? The answer came before he even finished asking. Yes. She practically threw herself into his arms. Yes, yes, yes. For a few moments, nothing else existed. No family pressure. No judgment. No criticism. Just love. Unfortunately, that peace lasted less than 24 hours. The next evening, Richard called an emergency family meeting. The moment Sarah walked into the living room, she knew something was wrong. Richard sat in his favorite chair. Victoria and Emily were on the couch. Their mother, Linda, looked nervous. Nobody smiled. Nobody congratulated her. Nobody even looked happy. Richard spoke first. Tell me it isn't true. Sarah frowned. What? The engagement. The room became silent. Sarah slowly raised her hand. The diamond ring sparkled under the lights. It's true. Richard stood immediately. You actually said yes? Sarah stared at him. You make it sound like a crime. Richard laughed in disbelief. It practically is. Dad. No. His voice rose. No, Sarah. Absolutely not. The room became tense. Linda tried to intervene. Richard, stay out of this. Sarah felt anger rising. Why are you acting like this? Because you're making a mistake. Victoria crossed her arms. Dad's right. Emily nodded. You could do so much better. Sarah looked from one sister to the other. You don't even know him. Victoria scoffed. We know enough. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Emily answered. He's a mechanic. The words hung in the air, as if that alone explained everything. Sarah looked at her sisters in disbelief. That's your problem? Victoria laughed. Our problem is that you're throwing your life away. The argument continued for nearly an hour. Every criticism hurt more than the last. Not because strangers were saying it, because her own family was. Finally, Richard delivered an ultimatum. If you marry him, don't expect my support. Sarah froze. What does that mean? It means exactly what it sounds like. Linda's face paled. Richard, I'm serious. Sarah's voice became shaky. You wouldn't come to my wedding? Richard looked directly into her eyes. If that's what it takes. For the first time, Sarah realized how deep his pride truly went. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder, more hostile. Without another word, she walked out. The moment she reached her car, she burst into tears. Daniel found her 20 minutes later. She was still crying. He sat beside her quietly. Neither spoke for a while. Eventually, Daniel handed her a tissue. She laughed weakly. "Do I look that bad?" "You look heartbroken." That answer made her cry even harder. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "What happened?" She told him everything. Every insult, every criticism, every cruel word. Daniel listened carefully. When she finished, he remained silent for several moments. Then he asked softly, "Do you want to cancel the wedding?" Sarah looked at him in shock. "What? If this is too much pressure." She immediately shook her head. "No." Daniel smiled. "Good. That's it." "What? Are you angry?" Daniel shrugged. "Would it change anything?" Sarah stared at him. Most men would have exploded. Most men would have demanded respect. Most men would have fought back. But Daniel wasn't most men. "They don't know me," he said. Sarah squeezed his hand. "They don't deserve you." A strange look crossed Daniel's face. If only she knew how true that statement really was. The months leading to the wedding became a nightmare. Word spread quickly through the family's social circles. People whispered. People judged. People gossiped. At charity events, Richard heard comments. At business meetings, people asked questions. At country club gatherings, people exchanged knowing looks. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. "Your daughter is marrying a mechanic?" Richard hated it. Absolutely hated it. The embarrassment consumed him. Meanwhile, Sarah faced constant criticism. One afternoon, she attended lunch with her sisters. It ended badly. Victoria leaned across the table. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah sighed. "What now?" "Do you honestly think he'll ever provide the lifestyle you're used to?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "There it is." "What?" "The money conversation." Emily joined in. "It's a valid question." "No," Sarah replied. "It's not." Victoria smirked. "It absolutely is." Sarah pushed her plate away. "You know what? I'm tired of this. Tired of reality. Tired of being judged." The sisters exchanged looks. Victoria shook her head. "We're trying to help you." "No." Sarah stood. "You're trying to make me become someone I'm not." Then she left. Neither sister followed, because neither sister understood. What they saw as failure, Sarah saw as happiness. A few weeks later, Richard struck another blow. He withdrew all financial support for the wedding. The news devastated Sarah. Not because she wanted the money, because it felt like another rejection. Another reminder that her father valued status more than her happiness. That evening, she sat alone in her apartment. The guest list spread across the table. Bills beside it. Expenses everywhere. The numbers weren't adding up. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. Could they really afford this wedding? A knock interrupted her thoughts. Daniel entered carrying takeout food. The moment he saw her face, he knew something was wrong. What happened? Sarah slid the papers toward him. Daniel reviewed them, then looked up. "That's all." She blinked. "That's all." He smiled. "We'll figure it out." "How?" "We always do, but we'll figure it out." The confidence in his voice surprised her, almost as if money wasn't a concern, almost as if he knew something she didn't, because he did. What Sarah still didn't know was that Daniel had enough money to buy every building on her father's street without checking his bank balance. Years earlier, Daniel had inherited a struggling technology company from his grandfather. Everyone expected it to fail. Instead, Daniel transformed it. He worked relentlessly, built new products, expanded globally, made brilliant investments. Within a decade, the company was worth billions. Daniel became one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in the country. But wealth came with a cost. Fake friendships, fake relationships, fake loyalty. People suddenly loved him, not because of who he was, because of what he had. Then one day, he walked away from the spotlight. He hired executives to run day-to-day operations, stopped appearing in interviews, avoided publicity, began living quietly, and when he met Sarah, for the first time in years, someone treated him like a normal human being. She never asked about money, never asked about status, never cared about wealth. She loved him before she knew anything, which was exactly why he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. Not yet, but the wedding day was approaching, and with it, the moment everything would finally change. The week before the wedding was the hardest week of Sarah's life. Instead of feeling excited, she felt exhausted. Every day seemed to bring a new problem. A relative declined the invitation. An old family friend suddenly became busy. Even some people who promised to attend stopped returning her calls. The message was clear. Many of them weren't rejecting the wedding. They were rejecting Daniel. One evening, Sarah sat alone in the venue after meeting with the coordinator. Most of the chairs had already been arranged. The decorations were nearly finished. Everything should have felt magical. Instead, she felt empty. Daniel arrived a few minutes later. The moment he saw her expression, he sat beside her. "Tough day." Sarah laughed weakly. "Tough month." Daniel nodded. "Fair." She stared at the rows of empty seats. "Do you ever wonder if they're right?" The question surprised him. "About what?" "About us." Daniel's expression softened. "Never." Sarah looked at him. "Not even once?" "Not even once." She swallowed hard. "Why?" Daniel smiled. "Because I've seen people at their best and worst." "What does that mean?" "It means I know what matters." Sarah looked down. "My family thinks money matters." Daniel gently lifted her chin. "Your family is wrong." For several seconds, they simply looked at each other. Then Daniel spoke again. "Let me ask you something." "Okay. If I lost everything tomorrow, would you still love me?" Sarah didn't even hesitate. "Of course." "Why?" "Because I didn't fall in love with your bank account." Daniel smiled. A deep smile. One that carried far more meaning than she realized. "That's why I'm marrying you." The night before the wedding, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his study staring at a framed family photograph. Everyone looked successful. Everyone looked perfect, at least on the outside. His phone buzzed. It was one of his business associates. Richard answered. "Hello." The man laughed. "So tomorrow's the big day." Richard sighed. "Apparently." "You don't sound excited." "I'm not." The man hesitated. Then came the question Richard hated most. "The mechanic?" Richard closed his eyes. "Yes." "The mechanic." The call ended a few minutes later, but the damage was already done. Richard felt humiliated. For months he had convinced himself he was protecting Sarah. But deep down, another emotion was driving him. Pride. The idea that his daughter could marry someone outside his social circle bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Sarah slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Because no matter what happened tomorrow, she knew one thing. She was marrying the man she loved. The next morning arrived quickly. The wedding venue buzzed with activity. Guests filled the seats. Music played softly. Conversations echoed through the building. Sarah stood in the bridal suite, preparing for the ceremony. Her heart raced, not from fear, from anticipation. A knock came at the door. She expected one of her bridesmaids. Instead, Richard walked in. The room immediately became tense. Sarah dismissed everyone else. Once they were alone, silence filled the space. Richard looked at her wedding dress. For a brief moment, his expression softened. She looked beautiful. Then reality returned. "Can we talk?" Sarah nodded. Richard stepped forward. "I don't want you to make a mistake." Sarah closed her eyes. "Not this again. Not today. Please, Dad. I'm serious." "You've been serious for a year." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't understand." "No." Sarah looked directly at him. "You don't understand." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you've never once asked if I'm happy." The words hit harder than she expected. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped, because she was right. Not once. Not a single time. Every conversation had focused on money, status, success, appearances, never happiness. Sarah wiped a tear from her eye. "You know what's sad?" Richard remained silent. You spent so much time worrying about what people think that you forgot to care about what I feel. The room became painfully quiet. Then Richard said the words that would later haunt him. Just don't embarrass his family today. Sarah froze. For several seconds, she simply stared at him. Then a slow smile appeared. Not a happy smile. A disappointed one. Dad. What? When this day is over, you're going to realize how wrong you've been. Richard shook his head. I doubt that. Sarah said nothing else, because explaining would ruin everything. The ceremony began moments later. Guests stood. Music filled the venue. Daniel waited at the altar, calm, confident, composed. Richard noticed something strange. Daniel didn't seem nervous, not even slightly. Most grooms looked terrified. Daniel looked relaxed, almost amused, as if he knew something nobody else did. Then Sarah appeared. The room fell silent. She walked slowly down the aisle. Daniel's eyes immediately locked onto hers. Everything else disappeared. The guests, the music, the drama, the criticism. None of it mattered. Only her. For the first time in months, Sarah felt completely at peace. When she reached the altar, Daniel smiled. You look beautiful. She laughed softly. You clean up pretty well yourself. The ceremony continued. The vows were simple, genuine, emotional. When Daniel promised to love her through every challenge life could bring, several guests wiped away tears. When Sarah promised to stand beside him no matter what happened, Daniel's eyes briefly glistened. Then came the moment. I now pronounce you husband and wife. The crowd erupted into applause. Daniel kissed his bride, and for a brief moment, everything seemed perfect. But the real story was only beginning. A few hours later, the reception was underway. Guests filled the ballroom. Music played. Food was served. People laughed and celebrated. Yet Richard remained irritated. Every time someone approached him, he felt judged. Every congratulation sounded fake. Every smile felt forced. Finally, he decided he had enough. He stood, walked toward the stage, and took the microphone. The room gradually quieted. Sarah immediately felt nervous. Daniel remained calm. Richard cleared his throat. I'd like to say a few words. The guests applauded politely. Richard looked directly at the newlyweds. At first, the speech sounded normal. He thanked everyone for attending, thanked family members, thanked friends. Then his tone changed. I'll admit something. Sarah's stomach dropped. Daniel remained expressionless. Richard continued. When Sarah first told me she was marrying Daniel, I was disappointed. The room became quiet, very quiet. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Sarah felt heat rise in her face. Dad. Richard ignored her. I believe my daughter deserved more. The silence deepened. Even Linda looked horrified. Richard kept going. I worried she was settling. Sarah wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Yet Daniel still sat calmly, watching, listening, waiting. I hope, Richard continued, that one day Daniel proves me wrong. The room felt frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody knew what to do. Then suddenly the ballroom doors opened. Every head turned. And what happened next would leave the entire room speechless. The ballroom doors swung open so hard they bounced against the walls. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Even Richard paused in the middle of his speech. A line of sharply dressed men and women entered the room. There were at least 20 of them. They weren't family members. They weren't wedding guests. And they certainly weren't people anyone expected to see. The room filled with confused whispers. Who are they? Do you know them? What's happening? Richard frowned. This wasn't part of the schedule. At the front of the group was a silver-haired man carrying a small gift box. The moment he entered, Daniel smiled. Not a surprised smile. A familiar one, as if he had been expecting him. Sarah noticed it immediately. Daniel simply squeezed her hand. Just watch. The silver-haired man approached the stage. Richard stepped aside, confused. Can I help you? The man smiled politely. Actually, I think we're here to help you. Richard blinked. What? The man accepted the microphone. The room became silent. Then he looked directly at Daniel. A smile spread across his face. Before anything else, I'd like everyone here to join me in congratulating our CEO on his wedding day. The ballroom froze. Nobody reacted, because nobody understood. The man continued. Congratulations, Daniel. A few of the newcomers began clapping. Then all of them joined in. Sarah stared at Daniel. Her heart began racing. CEO? What CEO? Richard frowned. I think there's been some mistake. The silver-haired man laughed. No mistake. He pointed toward Daniel. I'm speaking about him. The room erupted into whispers. Richard looked from the man to Daniel and back again. What are you talking about? The silver-haired man looked genuinely surprised. You don't know? Richard's face tightened. Know what? For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the man smiled. Oh! The single word sent a chill through the room. Oh my! The executives exchanged looks. Suddenly they understood. Daniel had never told them. The silver-haired man slowly turned toward the audience. Well, he chuckled. This just became interesting. Sarah could barely breathe. Daniel squeezed her hand again. His voice remained calm. It's okay. No. She shook her head. No, it isn't. What's happening? The silver-haired man motioned toward the large projector screen near the dance floor. One of the executives connected a device. A second later, the screen lit up. The first image appeared. A magazine cover. The headline stretched across the screen. Tech billionaire Daniel Morgan leads historic global expansion. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Sarah's eyes widened. Richard's face lost all color. The next image appeared. Daniel standing beside world leaders. The next, Daniel receiving a major business award. The next, a financial publication listing him among the country's wealthiest entrepreneurs. The next, another, and another, and another. Each image hit harder than the one before it. The whispers became louder. Oh my God! That's him. That's Daniel. No way. It can't be. Sarah felt completely overwhelmed. She looked at her husband, the same man who fixed cars, the same man who wore old jeans, the same man who insisted on living simply, the same man who never once mentioned any of this. Daniel. Her voice barely came out. You. Daniel smiled softly. I'm sorry. For what? For keeping it from you. Richard suddenly grabbed the edge of a nearby table to steady himself. His mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. It simply couldn't. The mechanic, the man he had mocked for months, the man he had publicly humiliated moments ago, the man he considered beneath his daughter. A billionaire? One of the wealthiest men in the country? His entire body felt numb. The silver-haired executive spoke again. Daniel transformed our company. The room listened in complete silence. When everyone else predicted failure, he built an empire. Another executive nodded. He changed thousands of lives. A third smiled. He changed ours too. Then the silver-haired man looked directly at Sarah. And clearly he found someone worth more to him than all of it. Sarah's eyes immediately filled with tears. The room exploded into applause. Some guests stood. Others remained frozen in shock. Richard couldn't move. Couldn't think, couldn't even breathe properly. Everything he believed had just collapsed. And then came the moment that hurt most. Daniel slowly stood. The applause continued. He walked toward the stage, toward Richard, toward the microphone, toward the truth. The room became silent once more. Daniel looked around. His voice was calm, measured, controlled. Thank you all for being here. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Daniel turned toward the executives. Thank you for coming. Then he looked at Sarah. His expression softened immediately. And thank you for being the best thing that has ever happened to me. Sarah wiped away tears. The audience smiled. Then Daniel looked at Richard. The atmosphere changed instantly. Everyone knew what was coming. Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, he felt ashamed. Daniel spoke quietly. You know something, Richard? Richard swallowed hard. What? For months, Richard had imagined himself winning every argument. He never imagined this. Daniel continued, "You were right about one thing." Richard looked confused. Yes. The room listened carefully. "You said people should prove who they are." Richard nodded slowly. Daniel smiled. "I agree." Then his expression became serious. "But people prove who they are in more ways than one." The silence became deafening. Daniel continued, "You thought I wasn't good enough because of my job." Richard said nothing. "You judged me before you knew me." Still nothing. "You decided my value based on what you thought I earned." The words landed like hammers, each one exposing a painful truth. Daniel wasn't yelling, wasn't attacking him, wasn't humiliating him, which somehow made it worse, because every word was true. Finally, Daniel said the sentence nobody in the room would ever forget. "You didn't reject me because I was a bad man." The room held its breath. "You rejected me because you thought I was poor." Complete silence. Richard felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward him, and for the first time in years, he had no defense, no argument, no excuse, nothing. Then Sarah slowly stood. The room turned toward her. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained strong, confident, unshaken. She looked directly at her father. "The person who embarrassed this family today wasn't me." Richard's heart sank. Sarah continued, "It wasn't Daniel either." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then she delivered a line that changed everything. "It was the people who believed someone's bank account mattered more than their character." The room erupted. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Guests rose from their seats. Even people who barely knew the couple stood in support. Richard remained frozen, because he knew she was right. Months of judgment, months of criticism, months of cruelty, all because he thought Daniel wasn't wealthy enough. And now everyone knew it. The applause lasted nearly a minute. Finally, Richard stepped forward. His eyes were wet. His voice cracked. "Sarah." She looked at him. "I'm sorry." The room became quiet again. Richard turned toward Daniel. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded respectfully, but didn't speak, because some wounds take time to heal. Richard swallowed hard. "I was wrong." Nobody expected those words, least of all Sarah. Richard looked at his daughter. "I spent so much time worrying about appearances that I forgot what mattered." Sarah felt tears return. Richard's voice broke completely. "I almost lost my daughter because of my pride." The room fell silent once more. And this time, nobody laughed. Nobody judged. Because everyone could see the pain in his face. Months later, the story spread far beyond that ballroom. Not because Daniel was rich. Not because he was a billionaire. But because people connected with the lesson. Sarah and Daniel used their wealth to fund scholarships, support struggling families, create opportunities for people who needed them. The same people many wealthy individuals ignored. And little by little, Richard changed too. Not overnight, but gradually. He learned to listen more, judge less, and value people for who they were rather than what they owned. One evening, nearly a year later, Richard sat with Sarah on a quiet porch. The sun was setting. The world felt peaceful. Richard smiled. "You know something?" "What?" He laughed softly. "For years I thought success was measured in dollars." Sarah smiled. "And now?" Richard looked toward the horizon. "Now I think success is having people who love you despite your mistakes." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard smiled. "You chose the right man." Sarah laughed. "Took you long enough." It definitely did. And for the first time in years, father and daughter laughed together. Because the richest person in that story was never the billionaire. It was a woman who saw value in a man long before she knew the size of his fortune. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell us honestly, if you were Sarah, would you have forgiven Richard after everything he said? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't miss our next emotional story.